Have you ever had the feeling that something inside your mind was trying to tell you something, but did you just ignore it? As if, for an instant, a thought appeared different from all the others, deeper, firmer, and yet you moved on, as if it were just another idea. What if that wasn't just a common thought? What if it was God trying to speak to you, but you didn't recognize it? There is a kind of silence that is not empty. It is in this silence that the mind begins to echo questions that you avoid during the day. At night, when everything slows down, when distractions move away, something starts to move inside. A light restlessness, almost imperceptible but insistent. A thought that comes back, then comes back again, and seems to carry a different weight. It's not noise, but it is not peace either. It is as if something is trying to cross the barrier of your own thoughts. What few realize is that not everything that goes through your mind was born in you. There is an invisible dimension where decisions are formed even before they are perceived. And within this dimension, there is a voice that does not scream, does not force, does not invade, but he whispers. A voice that many have heard, but few have learned to recognize. A form of communication so subtle that it can easily be mistaken for your own consciousness. There is a secret hidden in all this, something old, present since the most remote times, but which has been forgotten over time. A kind of spiritual code, simple in appearance, but deep enough to completely change the way you live, decide, and see your own life. And the most impressive thing is that this has always been accessible, but it was never explained in the right way, because there is a difference between thinking and be guided. There's a difference between imagining and receive direction. And when this difference is finally noticed, everything begins to change silently but irreversibly. Today, you are not here by chance. There is something that needs to be understood, something that you may have felt but have never been able to explain. And as you keep going, something inside of you will start to align in a way that maybe you didn't expect. It's not about information, it's about revelation. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. Now you will realize that nothing that happens inside your mind is by chance. On this path, you will understand how God plants thoughts that direct decisions, bring silent warnings, and release deep comfort. Each revelation connects with stories from Scripture, showing how to distinguish God's voice from fleeting emotions. As you continue, something inside begins to awaken and make sense. Maybe it's the answer you were looking for. If this touches you now, enjoy the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because your gesture can reach other lives today and bring light to those who need to hear this truth. And you will still realize that God speaks in an intimate, clear, and transforming way when the heart decides to listen with faith and surrender is written. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Philippians 2:13. There's something powerful going on when the noise dies down and you're finally left alone with your own thoughts. It is in this space where there are no distractions competing for your attention that something different begins to emerge. It's not an audible voice. It's not something that invades aggressively, but it's a soft perception, almost like a whisper that crosses your mind with unusual clarity. The problem is that most people never stay long enough in this silence to notice. They live surrounded by sounds, worries, screens, conversations, and a constant flood of stimuli that completely drown out this subtle communication. God does not dispute with noise. He reveals himself when the heart slows down. When everything is quiet on the outside, something begins to line up on the inside. Thoughts begin to organize, restlessness takes shape, and suddenly a direction emerges that was previously unclear. It's not confusion, it's not anxiety, it's different. It is firm, it is serene, and at the same time it carries an authority that does not come from you. It's as if something bigger is driving your line of reasoning. Many people say that God does not speak to them, but the truth is that they rarely create space to listen. Excess noise isn't just around, it's inside. Racing thoughts, constant worries, memories that don't stop repeating. All this forms a barrier that prevents the perception of what is spiritual. And while the mind is too full, the voice of God, which is subtle, goes unnoticed. When you learn to quiet your mind, something starts to change. You begin to realize that certain thoughts don't come out of nowhere. They arrive at the right time, with the right direction, bringing a peace that does not depend on circumstances. It is in this place that God begins to guide without forcing, to show without confusing, to direct without pressuring. And the more you value that silence, the more sensitive you become to recognize when He is speaking. The truth is that silence is not absence, it is ambience. It is the space where God chooses to manifest Himself in a deeper, more intimate, and more transformative way. And perhaps what you need most today is not more answers, but less noise. Because it is in the right silence that the right direction begins to appear within you in a clear and undeniable way, as it is written, "Be still, and know that I am God." Psalm 46:10. If, as you listen to this, something inside you has become calmer, as if a different peace has begun to take over, don't ignore that moment. Maybe it's no coincidence. If this spoke to you in a special way, write in the comments, "Amen," because sometimes a simple answer makes room for something much bigger to start within your life. Now that silence has begun to make room within you, something even deeper needs to be understood. Not every thought that crosses your mind was born in you. This is one of the most ignored and, at the same time, most liberating truths. Because there are times when an idea comes up with unusual clarity, a firm direction, a perception that just doesn't seem to come from your normal pattern of thinking. It's not confusing, it's not impulsive, it's not anxiety-laden. On the contrary, it is direct, it is clean, and it carries a kind of authority that does not need to be explained. Have you noticed this? That thought that arrives in the middle of an ordinary day, effortlessly, but that brings an answer that you have been trying to find for days. Or that internal impression that prevents you from making a decision, even when everything seems logical on the outside. This is no coincidence. There is a communication going on, but it is so subtle that it is only noticed by those who start paying attention. The problem is that the human mind has been trained to react too quickly. Thoughts come and go all the time, and most people don't stop to discern their source. But there is a clear difference between a thought generated by haste, fear, or desire, and the one who arrives with peace even when He confronts. God does not confuse. He aligns. He does not push. He directs. And when He speaks, even if it's within your mind, there's a coherence that touches something deeper than logic. There is also a detail that many overlook. Not every good thought is necessarily divine, and not every difficult thought is God's absence. Sometimes God's voice challenges, corrects, changes routes, and breaks expectations. But even when it does, it doesn't bring despair, it brings conviction. It's as if deep down you know it's right, even if it's not comfortable. Learning to recognize this changes everything, because you stop living reacting to what you feel and start responding to what God is communicating. Your mind ceases to be a place of confusion and becomes a space of discernment. And little by little, you begin to realize that God has always been speaking. You just hadn't learned to differentiate His voice in the midst of so many others. And that's exactly why it's written that God's thoughts aren't like ours, because they don't follow the same human pattern, aren't born from the same source, and don't produce the same results. Isaiah 55:8. If this word is awakening in you a deep desire to hear that voice more clearly, perhaps this is the time to respond. Write in the comments, Speak, Lord, your servant hears as a sincere prayer, and leave your like on this video, because this can take this message to other people who also need to learn to recognize when God is speaking within their own mind. As you begin to realize that not every thought comes from you, an inevitable and decisive question arises. How do you know where it comes from? Because here is a point that can completely change your spiritual life. Not every inner voice is from God. Some come from your emotions, others from your fears, others even from influences that are not visible but are real. And if you don't learn to discern, you run the risk of following paths that seem right but carry profound consequences. There is a detail that few consider. Mistakes are not always disguised as something negative. Often it presents itself as something logical, convincing, and even apparently good. This is exactly what happened when a voice tried to influence an important decision using arguments that made sense at the time, and yet there was something behind it, an intention that was not aligned with God's purpose. This reveals something serious. Not everything that seems right comes from the right source. Now pay attention to that. When a thought comes from God, it can even confront you. It can even take you out of your comfort zone, but it never generates inner confusion. There is a firmness, a clarity that is sustained even when you question. Thoughts that come from anxiety, flesh, or wrong influences, on the other hand, usually generate haste, fear, or even uncontrolled urgency. They push, press, accelerate. God's voice directs, but does not disorganize. Another important sign is in the fruit that this thought produces within you. Does it bring you closer to the truth, or does it push you away? Does it lead you to peace, or trap you in restlessness? Because God doesn't work through confusion, He brings light. Even when He corrects, He aligns. Even when He confronts, He builds. And that is why discernment is not just listening, it is observing the effect that voice generates within your mind and heart. The Bible makes this clear when it says not to believe every voice, but to test, analyze, discern. This demands attention. It requires sensitivity, and above all, it requires a heart that is willing not to accept any thought as truth. Because what you accept inside your mind has the power to direct your entire life. And perhaps at this very moment, you're beginning to realize that some thoughts you believed were not exactly what they seemed. And this is not to generate fear, it is to awaken discernment. Because when you learn to identify the origin, you stop being led in the dark and start walking clearly. It is written, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see if they are of God." 1 John 4:1. And if something within you is being awakened right now, like a light turning on, where there was once doubt, perhaps it is time to give a simple but true answer. Write in the comments, "God guides my mind, not as a habit, but as a decision." Because sometimes a small attitude makes room for a big transformation to start within you. There is an even deeper way for God to speak to your mind, something that does not depend on specific times or ideal circumstances. It is when His word ceases to be just a read text and starts to dwell within you, because when that happens, you don't have to look for answers all the time. They start to emerge from within, at the exact moment you need them. Notice this carefully. There are situations in which a thought comes quickly, precisely, almost like an automatic response, but with a wisdom that goes beyond your ordinary reasoning. This is no coincidence. It is the word that has been stored within you, coming to life at the right moment. It's not just memory, it's spiritual activation. It is God using what has already been planted to guide you in real time. When the mind is filled with truth, confusion loses space. When the word is alive within you, decisions are no longer based only on what you feel and are aligned with something bigger, and it completely changes the way you react to pressures, temptations, and doubts. because the answer does not come from outside. It emerges from within with authority. There is a very big difference between knowing the word and having the word inside the mind. To know is to remember at specific moments. To have it inside is to live connected. It is to allow it to shape your thoughts before you even realize it. And when this happens, even in moments of weakness, something rises within you to sustain you. That is how, in the face of intense pressure, firm responses emerged without hesitation. Not because there was time to think, but because there was already enough truth stored up to answer. This reveals a powerful principle. God speaks through what you allow to remain within you. If the mind is full of noise, it is the noise that will respond. But if it is full of the word, it is God who answers. And maybe now you're beginning to understand why certain moments in your life have felt empty or confusing. It wasn't God's absence, it was a lack of space filled with His truth. Because what you feed into your mind defines what will echo when the pressure comes. It is written, "I have hidden thy word in my heart, that I might not sin against thee." Psalm 119:11. And if you've made it this far, it's no coincidence. Something within you is being prepared, aligned, strengthened. At the end, there will be a special moment of prayer, where all of this will connect even more deeply within your life. So keep going, stay, because what is being built right now within your mind can completely transform how you hear, understand, and respond to God's voice. There is a type of warning that does not come with clear words, but with a feeling that is impossible to ignore. It's as if, in the middle of a common decision, something inside you gets stuck. He doesn't make noise, he doesn't explain, but he insists. A slight discomfort at first, then stronger until you realize that it's not just a doubt, it is a warning. And most people have felt this at some point, but they didn't always understand what was really happening at that moment. This type of signal does not come from logic. Often, everything around you feels right. Circumstances point to a path, people agree, the opportunity seems perfect. But within you, there is a silent resistance. And that's exactly where many go wrong. They ignore this warning because they cannot explain it with reason. But not everything that comes from God first passes through logic. Some directions come as an invisible break, a protection that acts even before the problem appears. There are times when moving forward seems like the best choice, but something inside you tells you to stop. It is not common fear, because fear paralyzes and confuses. This type of alert is different. He's specific, directed, and even without words, he communicates clearly. It's as if a line was drawn inside your mind, showing that crossing it can bring consequences that you can't yet see. The most impressive thing is that, many times, you only understand later, after you decide not to go, after you retreat, after you change direction. And then something happens that reveals the reason for that alert, and at this point, everything makes sense. You realize it wasn't just a random feeling, it was care, it was direction, it was God protecting you from something your eyes couldn't yet see. But there is an important detail. This type of communication requires sensitivity, because if the mind is too fast, in a hurry, overwhelmed by impulses or distractions, this alert goes unnoticed. God doesn't need to cry out to protect, he whispers. And only those who are attentive enough to listen beyond the obvious can perceive. Learning to recognize this discomfort can avoid wrong paths, hasty decisions, and even unnecessary pain. Because when God speaks through that inner alert, he's not limiting you, he's guarding. It is not hindering your advancement, it is directing you to something better, even if at that moment you do not fully understand it. It is written, and they were hindered by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in Asia. Acts 16:6. And if you've ever experienced something like this, that moment when you felt a break inside and then realized that it was deliverance, Maybe that wasn't a coincidence. Now state in the comments, Lord, I receive your teachings. Write it as an act of surrender and leave your like so that more people also learn to recognize this invisible care that God manifests within the mind. There is a delicate moment in the spiritual journey that many avoid, but which is absolutely necessary when God begins to confront his own thoughts. It's not comfortable, it's not lightweight, and it's often not something you expect. Because until then, you believe that you are right, that your decisions make sense, that your way of thinking is aligned. But suddenly, something starts to bother you in a different way. It's not that warning to stop, it's something deeper. It's as if a light was turned on inside your mind, revealing things that you didn't see before. God doesn't just comfort, he corrects. And this correction does not start with attitudes, it starts with thoughts. Because it is in the mind that everything is formed before becoming action. And when he decides to align you, he goes right to the root. It exposes intentions, reveals hidden motivations, shows where you made a mistake, where you justified the wrong, where you followed out of pride, fear, or impulse. And this process, while necessary, can be uncomfortable. The most curious thing is that this correction does not come with condemnation, but it also does not come with superficial softness. There is a weight of truth that touches deeply. It's as if, for a moment, you can no longer get away from what needs to be adjusted. And at that moment, you have two choices: resist or surrender. Resisting keeps everything as it is. Surrendering starts a transformation that starts inside and changes everything outside. Many people ask for direction, but few are prepared to be corrected. They want to hear God confirm what they have already decided, but they do not expect him to confront what needs to be changed. But God's voice is not limited to pleasing, it aligns. And aligning means adjusting roots, breaking patterns, and often reconstructing entire thoughts. And when you allow that, something powerful happens. The mind begins to clear itself of distortions, of wrong beliefs, of justifications that once seemed normal. You start to see more clearly, to think more truthfully, to decide more consciously, not because you became perfect, but because you became molded. This is one of the most profound ways God speaks to you, not only guiding you, but transforming you, not only showing you the way, but adjusting who you are to be able to walk on it. Because without this correction, any direction can be distorted by the wrong way of thinking. It is written, "Create in me, O God, a pure heart, and renew in me a right spirit." Psalms 51:10. And if, at some point, you felt that this message touched something deeper within you, perhaps that's exactly where God is working right now. If this made sense in your heart, take advantage of this moment to act. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, you help that word reach other people who also need that alignment. Be a part of it and allow this truth to continue spreading. There is a way for God to speak that many have experienced, but few can clearly identify. It does not come as words nor as structured thoughts, but as images. It suddenly appears in the mind as a scene, a detail, a symbol that seems to carry more meaning than it seems. Sometimes it's something fast, almost imperceptible. Other times it is so striking that it is difficult to ignore. And even without an immediate explanation, it remains, as if trying to say something beyond what the eye can see. The human mind was created not only to think, but also to visualize, and it is exactly in this space that God often chooses to communicate in a deeper way. Because images don't just go through logic, they reach directly to the interior. They awaken perceptions, generate understanding, and in many cases anticipate directions that have not yet been clearly revealed. The problem is that many people dismiss these experiences quickly, treating them as imagination or something unimportant. But not every image that pops into the mind is random. Some carry an order, coherence, and impact that go beyond the ordinary. They don't come loaded with confusion, but with a kind of quiet clarity. Even when they are not fully understood at the time, they leave a mark that makes you think about them again and again. There is also an important point that needs to be understood. Not every view is literal. Often, God speaks through symbols, representations that need to be discerned with spiritual sensitivity. It's not about interpreting everything literally, but realizing what it's awakening inside you. What direction it points, what feeling it generates, what kind of understanding begins to form from that image. And when this language begins to be recognized, something changes. You start to pay more attention, to value these moments more, not to ignore what once seemed unimportant. And little by little, these images stop being confusing and become clear, directed, and full of meaning. Because God does not speak in an empty way, everything he communicates has a purpose. It is written, "In the last days I will pour out my spirit, and your young men shall see visions." Acts 2:17. And perhaps, while you were listening to this, someone's face came to your mind or a specific situation came up unexpectedly. Don't ignore it. It can be more than just a memory. If someone has appeared in your heart right now, write their name in the comments. Let's together raise a chain of faith, presenting these names before God, believing that something powerful can begin to happen from this simple gesture. There is a sign that does not depend on logic, does not depend on external confirmation, and does not depend on anyone's opinion. It is a type of peace that arises unexpectedly, especially when everything around seems uncertain. And this confuses many people because the mind tries to understand, tries to calculate, tries to find security in circumstances. But this peace does not come from outside. It appears within, firmly, silently, and at the same time unquestionably. Have you ever been there? When a difficult decision is before you, when everything seems risky, when there are no guarantees. But still, something inside you remains calm. It's not carefree, it's not ignorance. It's different. It's as if, even without having all the answers, you know you're on the right track. This is one of the clearest ways God confirms that he is leading your mind, because when God speaks, he doesn't just direct, he sustains, and this support comes through peace. It doesn't mean that there won't be challenges. It doesn't mean that everything will be easy, but it does mean that within you there is a security that doesn't shake easily. It's as if your mind is guarded, protected from a level of anxiety that would normally dominate that situation. Now pay attention to this, because this is where many get confused. God's way does not always seem the most comfortable externally, but internally it carries peace, and at the same time, there are paths that seem perfect on the outside, but on the inside generate constant restlessness. This difference is essential. God does not guide by appearance, he confirms by peace. This peace does not scream, does not force, does not try to convince, it simply remains. Even when doubts appear, even when thoughts try to question, this peace is still there, like a firm foundation supporting everything. And the more you learn to recognize this, the more confident you are to make decisions without relying solely on what you see. And that is exactly why this peace is called something that exceeds understanding. Because it doesn't have to make complete sense to exist. It goes beyond logic, goes beyond fear, and establishes itself as a clear sign that God is present in that process. It's like an invisible seal telling you that even without all the answers, you're not alone. It is written, "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." Philippians 4:7. And if, at some point, you have felt this peace even in the midst of uncertainty, then you have already experienced God speaking directly within your mind. None of this is by chance. Stay until the end, because this journey will still reveal something that can completely transform the way you perceive, hear, and respond to God's voice in your life. There is a type of conflict that is not only emotional, nor the result of common indecision. It's deeper, more persistent, as if two directions are vying for space within your mind at the same time. On the one hand, what seems easier, more comfortable, more logical. On the other, a silent insistence that doesn't go away, even when you try to ignore it. And the more you try to follow a path, the more this conflict grows inside. Often, this type of tension is interpreted as confusion, anxiety, or even weakness, but that's not always the case. There are times when this conflict is actually a sign that God is working within you, lining up something that is not yet adjusted. Because when there is a difference between your will and God's leading, the mind finds no rest. She enters a state of restlessness that is not easily resolved. The most interesting thing is that this conflict does not disappear with distractions. You can try to occupy your mind, change your focus, look for justifications, but at some point it comes back as a constant reminder that there is something that needs to be faced. And this repetition is not random. It is divine insistence. It is a call that does not remain silent until it is recognized. There is a very clear difference between confusion and spiritual conflict. Confusion disorganizes, spreads thoughts, and weakens decisions. This specific conflict is directed. It revolves around a central point, a choice, a path that needs to be adjusted. It's as if everything inside you is being pressured to look at exactly what you're trying to avoid. And it is at this point that many resist. Because acknowledging this conflict means admitting that perhaps the path that seemed right is not aligned. It means relinquishing control, reconsidering decisions, and often changing direction. But as long as this resistance remains, the unrest continues. Not as a punishment, but as a sign that something has not yet been resolved. What few understand is that God does not allow this kind of conflict to destroy your peace, but to lead you to the truth. It is a process of realignment. It's like an internal adjustment that prevents you from calmly following a path that is not part of the purpose. And the more sensitive you become, the faster you recognize when this type of conflict is not common, but spiritual. And when there is finally surrender, something changes immediately. The tension begins to fade, the mind calms down, and that inner pressure gives way to a clarity that did not exist before. Not because everything has become easy, but because it is now aligned. Because the leadership has been accepted, and what used to generate conflict now generates peace. It is written, "But Jonah arose to flee from the presence of the Lord." Jonah 1:3. There is something that prevents many people from hearing God clearly, and it has nothing to do with distance or lack of faith. It has to do with how the mind has been shaped over time. Because the mind is not born ready, it is built by experiences, opinions, fears, beliefs, and patterns that accumulate. And without realizing it, the person starts to interpret everything through this old filter, including what God is trying to show. The problem is that God doesn't speak to a trapped mind, He speaks to an available mind. And there is a big difference between these two conditions. A stuck mind tries to fit everything into what it already believes. A renewed mind, on the other hand, is open to being transformed, corrected, and led by something greater than its own limitations. Perhaps you have already noticed this in a few moments. When a thought comes up in a different direction from what you've always believed, the first reaction is resistance. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit the old pattern. And it is exactly at this point that many miss the opportunity to hear God clearly. Because they prefer to maintain the familiarity of what they already know, rather than allowing something new to be built within them. The renewal of the mind is not automatic. It happens when you begin to question what you have always accepted as truth, when you decide to replace limited thoughts with deeper spiritual principles. It is a continuous process where old ideas are removed and new ways of thinking are established. And the more this happens, the easier it becomes to notice when God is speaking, because a renewed mind recognizes different patterns. It does not react with immediate fear. It does not close itself off in the face of the unknown. It does not reject what it confronts. On the contrary, it discerns, analyzes, and opens itself to understand. And in this environment, the voice of God finds space to manifest itself more clearly, without so much interference. There is also something important in all this. God doesn't just speak with a renewed mind. He reveals things that were previously hidden. Directions that didn't make sense begin to fall into place. Answers that seemed distant begin to emerge naturally. Not because God has begun to speak more, but because there is now the ability to understand better. And it completely changes the way you live. Decisions are no longer impulsive, thoughts are no longer confusing, and the mind operates at a level of clarity that once seemed impossible. It's not perfection, it's alignment. It is the difference between trying to understand on your own and allowing God to guide your understanding. It is written, "And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Romans 12:2. And if that word has found space within you now, maybe it's the beginning of something new being built in your mind. If this touched your soul in any way, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a simple decision expressed in words can mark the beginning of a quiet but profound transformation. There is a silent movement that happens within the mind that many mistake for simple remembrance, but which in fact can be God speaking directly and precisely. Suddenly, without warning, an old phrase comes back, a forgotten situation reappears, a word you've heard for a long time comes to life again. And it's not random. There is an exact moment, a specific reason, as if that memory is being activated exactly when you need it most. Have you noticed this happening? In the midst of a decision, something from the past emerges clearly, not as nostalgia, but as direction. A conversation, a teaching, a piece of advice that seemed distant. And all of a sudden, it fits perfectly into what you're living now. This is not just the natural workings of the mind. There is a spiritual intelligence bringing to light what was kept but not forgotten. The most impressive thing is that these memories do not come empty. They carry meaning, bring understanding, often reveal mistakes that need to be corrected or paths that need to be resumed. It's as if God is rearranging pieces within your mind, connecting past and present to align your future. And there are times when this happens even more profoundly. Memories that bring confrontation, that clearly show where you went astray, where you ignored something important, where you could have heard more. And while this can generate discomfort, it also makes room for something powerful, transformation. Because when the truth is remembered at the right time, it has the power to change decisions immediately. But there are also memories that come as consolation. Words you've heard in hard times, promises that seemed far away, experiences that prove God has been with you before. And these memories come as a silent reminder that He is still present, that nothing has been lost, that everything is still being conducted. The detail is that not every memory is spiritual, but when it is, it carries a different weight. It doesn't get lost quickly. It doesn't mix with distractions. It doesn't generate confusion. On the contrary, it illuminates, organizes, and directs. And the more you learn to recognize this, the more you begin to understand that God doesn't just talk about the future. He also uses the past to align you in the present. It is written, "But that Comforter will bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." John 14:26. And if you're here now, it's no accident. Perhaps something has already been awakened within your mind, some memory, some word, some perception that has begun to make sense. Don't ignore it. Stay until the end, because there is something even deeper being prepared. And it may be exactly the answer you needed for this moment in your life. There are times when life seems to spiral completely out of control. Unexpected situations arise, problems pile up, answers disappear, and the mind enters a state of constant urgency. It is as if everything is screaming at the same time, demanding an immediate solution. And in this scenario, despair tries to take over, accelerating thoughts, creating negative scenarios, and weakening faith. But it is precisely in this environment of chaos that something surprising happens. God's voice becomes even more necessary and often clearer. The problem is that desperation makes too much noise inside. It takes up space, distorts perceptions, and prevents you from hearing accurately. When the mind is dominated by fear, everything seems bigger than it really is. The waves seem uncontrollable, the wind seems unbearable, and the feeling is that there is no way out. But the truth is, even in the midst of this storm, God doesn't lose control. And more than that, He keeps talking. There is something profound about this. God's voice in the crisis does not come to feed fear, but to confront it. She doesn't despair, she interrupts. It is a voice that brings awareness in the midst of confusion, that repositions the mind when everything seems to fall apart. And often it comes with a simple but powerful question that completely changes the way you're looking at the situation. Because in the midst of crisis, the biggest challenge is not what's happening outside, but what's happening inside you. If the mind is lost, everything intensifies. But if the mind aligns, even if the situation remains difficult, something changes in the way you face it. There arises a firmness, a clarity, a trust that does not depend on the absence of the problem, but on the presence of God. And it is at this point that many begin to perceive something transformative. Crisis is not only a time of pain, but also an environment where God's voice can be heard more deeply. Because when all other voices lose strength, His voice finds room to stand out, not as a shout, but as a firm direction that brings balance in the midst of chaos. It is written, "Why are you so timid? Yet you have not faith." Mark 4:40. And if you've ever experienced times when everything seemed out of control, but still something inside you was sustained, then you've experienced that voice in the midst of the storm. If this truth touches your heart right now, write Amen in the comments. Sometimes acknowledging God's goodness, even in difficult times, is the first step to seeing that He has never ceased to be present. While you sleep, when your conscious mind slows down and rational control loses strength, there is a space that opens silently. It is in this place that God often chooses to speak in a different way, without distractions, without outside interference, without resistance. Because during the day, your mind questions, analyzes, doubts, but during sleep, these barriers diminish, and that which is spiritual finds a freer way to manifest itself. Have you ever woken up with a dream that seemed different from all the others? Not just a random sequence of images, but something that carried a weight, a feeling, a message that kept echoing even after opening my eyes. It wasn't confusing like an ordinary dream, nor was it quickly lost. On the contrary, it remained. And the more you thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. This is because not every dream is just the fruit of the mind. Some are common, reflections of what you have lived, thought, or felt throughout the day. But there are others that come loaded with something more. They don't just show images, they communicate. Sometimes in a symbolic way, other times in a direct way, but always with a purpose that goes beyond the natural. The main point is not just to have the dream, but to discern what it carries. Because when God speaks through dreams, He doesn't bring confusion. Even if the message is not entirely clear at first, there is an order, a coherence, a sense that it should not be ignored. It is different from an ordinary dream that quickly falls apart. This type of experience remains, comes back to mind, draws attention, and often these dreams bring direction, warnings, or even revelations about situations that have not yet happened, not to generate fear, but to prepare, align, and guide. It is as if God is showing something before, giving the opportunity to understand, adjust, or simply be ready for what is to come. But here there is an important precaution. Not every dream should be interpreted as a divine message. Therefore, sensitivity and discernment are necessary. Observe the impact it causes, the clarity it brings, and especially if it is aligned with spiritual truth. Because God does not contradict himself, and what comes from him always points in direction, not confusion. And when you start to recognize that, your perception changes. What was previously ignored is now observed. What seemed unimportant begins to gain meaning. And little by little you understand that God doesn't just speak when you're awake. It also accesses your mind when all is silent. It is written, God speaks in dreams and visions of the night. Job 33:14-15. And maybe you've experienced something like this and didn't care about it at that moment. But now something is starting to make sense. And if you're here, listening to this, it's no accident. There is something being revealed, something that can change the way you perceive even what happens while you sleep. So keep going, because what's yet to come can open your eyes in a way you never imagined. There is a place inside you where it is not possible to lie for long. You can justify attitudes, find explanations, convince other people. But within itself, there is a point where the truth always manifests itself. That place is consciousness. And that's exactly where one of the most profound ways God speaks happens, in a direct, silent, and impossible way to ignore when you decide to pay attention. Conscience does not scream, but neither is it silent. It accuses when something is out of place, and brings peace when there is alignment. And the most impressive thing is that it does not depend on someone teaching you what is right or wrong at that moment. There is an inner knowledge that simply knows. You can even try to ignore it, you can try to postpone, you can try to justify it. But that feeling remains, like an insistent echo saying that something needs to be adjusted. Often, people look for grandiose signs, external answers, visible confirmations, but they ignore this internal tribunal where God is already speaking clearly. Because listening to one's conscience requires courage. It requires facing truths that are not always comfortable. It requires recognizing when a decision is not aligned, even if it seems advantageous from the outside. And there is a detail that changes everything. When you start respecting your conscience, it becomes more sensitive. What previously went unnoticed is beginning to become evident. Small attitudes begin to generate alerts. Simple choices start to carry weight, and you realize that you are being guided from the inside out. But when awareness is ignored repeatedly, it becomes quieter. Not because it ceased to exist, but because it was suffocated by constant choices that disregarded it. God uses this space in a powerful way, not just to prevent mistakes, but to drive decisions that reflect truth, justice, and purpose. It is as if there is an internal judgment going on all the time, where every thought, every intention, every choice is evaluated on a level that goes beyond appearance. And when you learn to listen to that place, you begin to live more clearly, more steadily, and less confused. Awareness also reveals something important. It not only points out the mistake, but also confirms the rightness. When you make an aligned decision, there is a different peace, a lightness that does not depend on anyone's opinion. It is as if, inside you, something says it is correct, even if no one else sees or understands it. And it is in this balance that God's voice manifests itself with depth, not as something distant, but as a constant presence that guides, corrects, and confirms. Because even before any external response, God has already established within you a place where the truth can be heard clearly. It is written, "They show the work of the law written in their hearts, testifying together to their conscience." Romans 2:15. There is a kind of silence that bothers you deeply because it doesn't bring answers, it doesn't bring clear direction, and it seems to leave the mind walking alone in the midst of uncertainty. It's when you pray, wait, look for a sign, and nothing happens the way you imagined. No immediate answer, no evident confirmation, just a void that generates questions. And at that moment, many think that God has moved away, that he has stopped speaking, that he is not present. But what looks like absence may actually be a deeper form of communication. God's silence does not mean abandonment, it means process, because there are things that cannot be taught with words alone. There are levels of faith that are only built when you keep walking even without hearing, even without feeling, even without fully understanding. And it is exactly in this environment that confidence stops depending on emotions and starts to be supported by something more solid. The most challenging thing is that during this silence, the mind tries to fill the void. Thoughts arise, doubts appear, insecurities gain strength. You start to question if you are on the right path, if you made the right choice, if you should go back. And it is at this point that faith is really tested. Because continuing to move forward without visible confirmation requires a trust that goes beyond the natural. But there's something going on in that silence that you don't always notice. God is watching how you react when there are no easy answers. He's strengthening his ability to trust, to stand firm, to not depend only on external signs to keep going. It's like an invisible training where every step you take in the midst of uncertainty builds a deeper foundation within you. And when this period passes, something changes. Your faith is no longer superficial. It no longer depends on emotional moments. It becomes stable, firm, resistant. You begin to realize that God never stopped being there, even when he didn't speak the way you expected. The silence was not empty, it was preparation. There is a maturity that is only born in this place, a security that does not come from quick answers, but from the certainty that even without seeing, without hearing, without understanding everything, you continue to be guided. Because God does not lose control in silence, he only changes the way he leads. It is written, "Behold, I am going forth, but it is not there. But he knows my way," Job 23, 8-10. And if that message found you in a moment of waiting, maybe it's just what you needed to hear right now. Just as this word has come to you, other people also need this same comfort. By interacting with this video, you help this message reach those who are going through this silence today. If you want to be part of it, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, allowing this truth to reach even more lives. There is a way for God to speak that is often ignored because it seems too ordinary. It does not come through an inner thought, nor a dream, nor a sensation, but through someone. A seemingly simple conversation, a sentence said at the right time, advice that touches exactly where it needs to be. And the most impressive thing is that many times the person does not even realize that he is being used, but what has been said crosses his mind with a precision that cannot be explained. Have you ever experienced something like this? When someone says something that seems directed exactly at you, even without knowing everything that is happening inside your life. It wasn't agreed, it wasn't planned, but it hits hard. And in that instant, something inside you recognizes that it wasn't just an opinion, it was more than that. It was direction. But here there is an essential point that needs to be understood. Not every voice that comes from someone else is from God. And that is exactly why discernment becomes so important, because there are words that confuse, pressure, generate fear, or even divert. And there are words that, even when they confront, bring clarity, alignment, and a sense of truth that remains. The difference is in the effect it produces within you. When God uses someone, the message does not depend on who speaks, but on the impact it generates. It may be simple, it may be direct, but it carries a spiritual weight that goes beyond logic. It does not force, it does not manipulate, but it does not go unnoticed either. She finds something inside you that she recognizes, even if you don't want to admit it at that moment. And many times, this voice comes to confirm what God has already been working inside your mind. It's as if an external piece fits perfectly with something internal that you already felt. And when this happens, doubt begins to lose strength because confirmation becomes evident. But there are also times when that voice comes to correct, to show you something you didn't want to see, to confront thoughts that were misaligned. And while this may generate discomfort at first, it later brings clarity. Because the correction that comes from God does not destroy, it adjusts. It doesn't confuse, she reveals. Learning to hear God through others requires humility. It requires recognizing that the answer will not always come the way you expect. Sometimes it will come through someone unlikely, at an unexpected time, with simple words, but loaded with direction. And when you start developing that discretion, something changes. You stop hearing only with your ears and start perceiving with the Spirit. It begins to identify when a word is only human and when it carries something beyond. It is written, "Hear counsel and receive correction, that thou mayest be wise." Proverbs 19:20. There is a dangerous moment that many do not realize while it is happening. It is not when God stops speaking, but when the person begins to ignore what he has already heard. At first, the voice comes clear, insistent, bringing direction, alerting, correcting. But when that voice is repeatedly ignored, something begins to change inside, not in the way God speaks, but in the way the mind responds. In the beginning, there is a discomfort, a feeling that something is not right, that decision should not be made, that path is not aligned. But even so, the person continues. And when that happens once, there's still sensitivity. When it happens several times, this sensitivity begins to decrease. What used to bother is now tolerated. What was once clear is starting to become distant. This is the beginning of a silent process called hardening. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not something visible immediately, but it forms little by little. The mind begins to adapt to error, the heart begins to justify what it once rejected, and the voice of God, which continues to speak, no longer finds the same opening. The most serious thing is that over time, the person stops realizing that he is ignoring. He starts to believe that everything is normal, that he is in control, that he is making his own decisions. But in fact, he has already lost the sensitivity to discern what comes from God. And when that happens, the direction is lost, even if outwardly everything seems to be working. There's a pattern to that. The more one resists the truth, the more difficult it becomes to accept it afterwards. Not because God has stopped speaking, but because the interior no longer responds in the same way. It is as if the conscience was being silenced little by little, until what was previously evident becomes almost imperceptible. But here's an important point. This process does not start with big decisions. It starts with the small details. Small warnings ignored, small corrections rejected, small directions despised. And it is these small moments that, accumulated, form a barrier that prevents the mind from hearing clearly. Therefore, there is an urgent call in all this, not to generate fear, but to awaken consciousness. Because while there is perception, there is still opportunity for adjustment. As long as you can recognize that something isn't right, there's still room to come back, to align, to listen again, sensitively. It is written, "Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." Hebrews 3:15. And if somehow this message brought up something you were already feeling, don't ignore this moment. Sometimes acknowledging is already the first step to change. If this spoke to you, write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Not as repetition, but as a decision to listen again with an open heart. There is a silent key that unlocks deeper levels of communication with God, and that key is not just in listening, but in responding. Because there is a difference between perceiving God's voice and acting on it. Many go so far as to recognize that God is speaking. They feel the direction, they understand the way, but they hesitate at the moment of decision. And that's exactly when something stops happening. Obedience is not just an external response, it is an internal alignment that activates new perceptions. When you respond to what God has already shown, something opens up inside your mind. It is as if the clarity increases, as if new directions begin to emerge more clearly. Not because God has begun to speak more, but because there is now an flow. There is a living connection between listening and acting. The opposite is also true. When there is resistance, when there is postponement, when you understand what needs to be done but choose to wait, the perception begins to weaken. Not because God walked away, but because the connection was broken. The voice is still there, but the sensitivity decreases. And what was once clear begins to seem distant. There is something powerful about immediate obedience. Even when there aren't all the answers, even when the path isn't yet fully visible, taking a step based on the direction you've already received creates a spiritual movement. It is as if each step opens the next. You don't see everything at once, but you see enough to keep going. And this process builds trust that grows with each aligned decision. Often people wait to fully understand before acting. They want guarantees, they want security, they want control. But God works differently. He shows what is necessary for the moment, and from the answer reveals the rest. This requires faith, but it also reveals something deeper: relationship. Because listening and obeying is not just following instructions, it is walking in tune. And the more you live in this way, the more natural it becomes to recognize God's voice. The mind stops questioning everything all the time and starts to discern more clearly. Decisions that once generated doubt are now made with conviction, not because everything is easy, but because there is a trust built by experience. Obedience does not limit, it expands. It doesn't arrest, it directs. And each time you choose to respond, something new is released. New ideas, new perceptions, new opportunities that were not visible before. Because God's direction is not static, it is progressive. It is written, "Come out of your land, and I will show thee," Genesis 12:1. And maybe at this point there's something you already know you need to do. Something that has already been shown, has already been felt, has already been confirmed. And as you continue here listening, something inside you begins to realize that it is not just about understanding more, but about responding to what has already been revealed. What you'll hear below may shed even more light on this process, but it only makes sense for those who are willing to take the next step. Stay until the end, because there is something that can completely transform the way you move from the voice of God. There are times when life seems to be following a predictable, controlled, even comfortable path. Everything is already organized within a known logic, decisions have already been made, limits have already been accepted. And then, without warning, something breaks that stability. It doesn't start on the outside, it starts inside. An idea, a different restlessness, a conviction that was not there before, and that just won't go away. This type of call does not ask for permission. It installs itself. At first, it may seem like just an unusual thought, something fleeting, but the more you try to ignore it, the more it grows. He comes back in moments of silence, appears in the middle of the routine, repeats himself in different ways. And little by little you start to realize that it's not just a desire, it's something deeper, something that seems to come from a place you don't control. Most challengingly, this calling almost always confronts its limitations. It doesn't come when you feel ready, prepared, or capable. On the contrary, it appears precisely where you feel insufficient, and this generates an immediate internal conflict. The mind begins to list reasons for not following, arguments for retreating, justifications for staying where it is. But even so, that conviction does not disappear. Because when God awakens something within you, He's not just suggesting a change, He's revealing a purpose that already existed but was dormant. And when that happens, staying in the same place starts to become uncomfortable. What once seemed sufficient no longer satisfies in the same way. There is a feeling that something needs to be done, even without knowing exactly how. This kind of experience does not depend on grandiose external signs. Sometimes everything happens inside the mind. It is there that God begins to expand your perception, to show you possibilities that you never considered, to awaken a responsibility that you did not seek, but that you can no longer ignore. And the more you resist, the more that voice becomes present. There is also an important detail. God's call is not accompanied by all the answers. It shows enough to awaken, but not enough to control. This requires a step of faith, a decision that does not depend on guarantees, but on trust. And this is exactly what defines who advances and who remains stationary. When you respond to that call, something changes immediately, not necessarily around, but within you. Doubt begins to give way to a firmer direction. Fear loses some of its strength, and a new consciousness begins to form. Not because everything has become clear, but because you are now aligned with that which has been awakened. It is written, "Come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people out of Egypt." Exodus 3:10. There is a deeper level of spiritual experience that goes beyond simply hearing God. It's when you not only perceive a direction, but feel a presence that takes over your mind completely. It's not just an isolated thought or a clear idea. It's as if the entire internal environment was filled with something bigger, something that reorganizes everything inside without needing long explanations. Have you ever had a moment when suddenly everything was different inside you? Worries lost strength, racing thoughts slowed down, and clarity began to emerge almost instantaneously. It was not because all the problems disappeared, but because something inside changed. This happens when God's presence manifests in the mind, not just as a voice, but as an atmosphere. This presence does not bring confusion, it organizes. It doesn't bring weight, she aligns it. It is as if, for an instant, everything that was out of place found its correct position. Thoughts that were previously scrambled begin to make sense, doubts lose intensity, and a deeper perception begins to emerge. It's not effort, it's an answer. It is not an attempt, it is a demonstration. The most impactful thing is that this experience does not depend on external circumstances. It can happen in the middle of an ordinary day, at an unexpected time, even in the midst of difficulties. Because it's not the surrounding environment that changes first, it's the internal environment. And when this happens, the way you see everything around you also changes. There is something powerful about that. When God's presence surrounds the mind, it not only brings peace, but also purifies. Thoughts that were not aligned begin to lose space, intentions are adjusted, perceptions are refined. It is as if a light is lit within you, revealing what was previously hidden and bringing clarity where there was doubt. And in this place, you don't need a lot of words. Presence speaks for itself. It communicates safety, direction, and truth in a way that goes beyond ordinary language. And the more you become sensitive to this, the more you begin to recognize when it's not just a thought of yours, but something bigger enveloping you. It is written, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory, Isaiah 6:3. And if, as you listen to this, something inside you has begun to quiet down, as if a gentle presence is taking space, don't ignore that moment. Maybe it's an opportunity to open your heart even more. If you want, write in the comments your prayer request, what is inside you right now. Because when we unite in faith, something powerful happens, and that transforming presence from within can reach even more deeply everything you need. There is a way for God to speak that goes unnoticed by most people, precisely because it does not seem extraordinary. It doesn't come with grandiose signs. It doesn't interrupt everything in an obvious way. It doesn't draw attention immediately. On the contrary, it happens in the simplest details, in the small situations of everyday life, in what would easily be ignored. And that's exactly where many miss important directions. Have you ever noticed how certain small events seem to connect almost perfectly? How do unexpected encounters, simple attitudes, or even seemingly ordinary decisions begin to form a pattern? It's not something blatant, but it's not random either. There is an invisible line connecting these details, as if something is organizing the path without you noticing it right away. The problem is that the mind accustomed to the obvious tends to ignore the subtle. He expects something big, something clear, something impossible to doubt. But God often chooses to speak differently. It moves into details that require attention, sensitivity, and a mind willing to observe beyond the surface. Because when you learn to perceive the small, you begin to understand the large. There are times when a simple attitude of someone, a word out of context, or even a situation repeated more than once starts to catch your attention. Not for the intensity, but for the precision. It's as if it was pointing to something bigger, even without fully explaining it. And when you put these points together, a direction begins to emerge that was not visible before. This type of communication requires an attentive heart. It's not about analyzing everything obsessively, but about realizing when something carries a meaning beyond the ordinary. Because God does not work by chance. Even what seems simple can be loaded with purpose. And the more you become sensitive to this, the more you begin to realize that your life is not being conducted randomly. There is also a silent confirmation in these details. When something comes from God, even if it is small, it fits with what is already being worked on within you. It does not create confusion. It does not disorganize. But it complements, confirms, reinforces. It is as if small pieces were being fitted together to form a complete image, and it is at this point that the mind begins to change. You stop expecting only big signals and start valuing small directions. He begins to realize that God is not distant, but present in every detail, in every moment, in every situation that at first glance seemed ordinary. It is written, "Let the young woman be then to whom I say, lower your jar. Let her be the one you have appointed," Genesis 24:14. There are areas within the mind that remain closed for years, protected by routines, distractions, and even self-sufficiency. But there are times when pain breaks through these barriers, inevitably. It's not something that the person chooses, it's not comfortable, it's not wanted, but it happens. And when it happens, something profound opens up. Thoughts change, priorities reorganize, and what once seemed distant begins to become urgent. Pain has a unique ability to silence everything that is superficial. What used to take up space in the mind loses importance, and what really matters begins to emerge with force. It is in this place where the heart is exposed and defenseless that the voice of God finds a more direct access. Not because he depends on pain, but because in that moment the mind is finally open to truly listening. Have you ever noticed how, in the most difficult moments, different thoughts arise? They are not just concerns or questions, but deeper reflections, perceptions that were not there before. It is as if in the midst of suffering something begins to be revealed, not immediately or easily, but gradually, bringing understanding where before there was only pain. And there is something even stronger about it. God doesn't just speak in pain, He plants something inside it. Even in the midst of suffering, thoughts of hope, direction, and purpose begin to arise. It is not a denial of reality, but it is a force that prevents you from losing yourself completely. It's as if in the middle of the darkness, small lights begin to appear, guiding you step by step. The most impressive thing is that many times, it is in these moments that communication with God becomes more intimate. No masks, no distractions, no attempts at control. Just truth. And in this truth, the mind begins to be transformed from the inside out, not just to get out of the pain, but to come out different. Because when God speaks at that level, He doesn't just comfort, He rebuilds. He takes broken thoughts, wounded emotions, and begins to rearrange everything with a greater purpose. And what seemed to be just suffering becomes a meeting point where something new begins to be born. It is written, "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted," Psalms 34:18. And if at some point you felt touched by these words, as if something within you had been reached in a deeper way, maybe that's no coincidence. Maybe that's exactly where God is speaking right now. If this made sense to your soul, write in the comments, "God chose me." Sometimes, acknowledging this is the first step to turning the pain into a new beginning. There is a kind of void that no explanation can fill. It is when something is lost, when an absence sets in, when the mind tries to understand but does not find enough answers to relieve the weight that is inside. In these moments, even thoughts become tired, repetitive, revolving around the same pain, the same question, the same feeling that something is missing. And the more you try to solve this logically, the more you realize that it's not enough. It is in this place that something different begins to happen. It is not immediate, it is not forced, but it comes unexpectedly. A thought that does not follow the pattern of pain, a feeling that does not match despair, a peace that does not seem to make sense in the face of what you are experiencing. And that's exactly what makes this moment so special. Because it doesn't come from you. It is not born of your mind. It is not produced by your effort. It's God speaking in a way that surpasses anything you could build on your own. This kind of consolation does not eliminate reality, but it completely changes the way you carry it. The pain may even continue to be present, but it no longer dominates in the same way. There is a quiet relief, an inner strength that sustains, a clarity that begins to emerge in the midst of confusion. It's as if, in the midst of loss, something inside you is found. The deepest thing about it all is that this voice doesn't just bring comfort, it brings reconnection. It reorganizes the mind, calms the heart, and repositions the way you see everything around you. What seemed to have no way out begins to take on a new meaning, not because everything has been resolved, but because now you are no longer facing alone. And there is a detail that changes everything. That consolation doesn't need many words. Sometimes a single sentence, a single perception is enough to completely transform the internal environment. Because when God speaks at this level, He reaches a place that no other voice can reach. It is written, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me," John 14:1. And perhaps, at this moment, you are carrying something that no one else fully understands. Perhaps there is a silent pain, an absence, an unanswered question. But if you've made it this far, there's a reason. Something is being prepared within you. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may touch exactly that area that you thought no one could reach. There are times when God's voice comes not just as a gentle direction, but as an urgency that pulses within the mind in a way that is impossible to ignore. It's not anxiety, it's not human haste, it's something different. It is as if a fire began to ignite from within, bringing a certainty that something needs to be done, something that cannot be postponed, something that requires an immediate response. You feel it as a specific restlessness, but not a confusing one. On the contrary, it is extremely targeted. It's not too many thoughts at once. It's a clear focus that returns again and again. You try to distract yourself. You try to leave it for later. You try to rationalize, but it keeps coming back with the same intensity. And the more you ignore it, the stronger it seems to get. This urgency is not born of fear. It is born of responsibility. It is as if God is awakening within you the awareness that there is something greater at stake, something that involves purpose, impact, direction. And this feeling does not allow accommodation. It takes you out of your comfort zone, breaks with passivity, and puts before you a choice: respond or keep postponing. The most striking thing is that this urgency does not depend on perfect conditions. She doesn't expect you to feel ready, prepared, or safe. It simply comes, bringing with it a conviction that is not based on external assurances. And that generates an internal confrontation, because the mind tries to find reasons to wait while that inner flame insists that the time is now. There is a spiritual weight to this. It's not pressure, it's called. It is the perception that ignoring can mean missing something important, letting a moment pass that is not repeated in the same way. And the more you become sensitive to this voice, the more you understand that there are specific times to act, times when the response needs to be immediate. And when you decide to obey that urgency, something moves quickly. Paths begin to open, situations begin to align, and that inner intensity begins to transform into practical direction. Not because everything has become easy, but because you have now entered the flow of what God is leading. But when that urgency is ignored repeatedly, it can weaken, not because it is no longer important, but because it has been postponed so many times that it has lost space in your attention. Therefore, recognizing this type of voice is essential, because it doesn't come all the time in the same way, and when it does, it carries a specific purpose. It is written, "His word was in my heart like a burning fire," and could not contain Jeremiah 29. And if, as you listen to this, something inside you is being awakened like a flame that you've tried to ignore before, maybe this is the time to respond. And if this message reached you, it was not by chance. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate notifications, because this can be the way to continue receiving exactly what your mind and spirit need at this time. There is a decisive point in the way God speaks to his mind that separates those who only hear from those who actually live what they have heard. This point is called faith, because hearing a direction when everything makes sense is easy, but standing firm when nothing around confirms what has been said. This requires something deeper. It requires holding within you a certainty that cannot yet be seen on the outside. The human mind has been trained to trust what it sees, what it can touch, what it can control. But when God speaks, he often breaks with this logic. It shows something that has not yet happened, points to a path that is not yet formed, reveals a direction that seems to have no basis at the moment. And that's exactly where faith comes in. Not as a feeling, but as a decision to trust beyond the evidence. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to maintain a conviction when everything around you seems to contradict? Thoughts begin to arise. Doubts try to weaken what you have received, and the mind seeks evidence to sustain itself. But faith is not based on what is visible, it is based on what has been said, and when that trust is maintained, something begins to strengthen within you. There is a silent construction going on. Each time you decide to keep believing, even without seeing immediate results, your mind becomes firmer, more stable, less dependent on circumstances, and it completely changes the way you react to time, challenges, and uncertainties. Because you are now no longer waiting for external confirmation to continue, you already have an internal conviction that underpins your steps. The most interesting thing is that faith does not eliminate questions, but prevents them from dominating. You may not yet understand everything, you may not yet see how it will happen, but there is something inside you that remains steadfast. And this firmness is not built overnight. It grows with each choice to trust, and when you live that way, something starts to happen. What once seemed impossible begins to take shape. Paths begin to emerge, situations begin to align, and what was only inside your mind begins to manifest into reality, not because you forced it, but because you stood by what God said. It is written, "By faith Noah prepared the ark for the salvation of his family." Hebrews 11:7. There is a dimension of God's voice that reveals not only the next step, but the true meaning of what you are experiencing. Because there are times when the mind sees life in a fragmented way, as if each situation were isolated, with no connection to something bigger. But when God begins to align his thoughts, something changes. You come to realize that nothing is random, that there are invisible connections between events that once seemed ordinary. At first, everything seems just circumstance, a place where you are, a position you occupy, an opportunity that arose without explanation. But suddenly, something starts to make sense in a deeper way. A different thought arises, bringing a perception that you have never had before. It is as if a layer has been removed, revealing that what seemed to be chance actually carries purpose. This kind of revelation doesn't happen all at once. It comes little by little, as your mind aligns with God. Because while the mind is stuck only on what is immediate, it cannot see beyond. But when there is openness, when there is sensitivity, God begins to show what is behind the situations. And what once seemed common now has a different weight. You begin to realize that certain positions were not earned by human effort alone, that certain meetings did not happen by coincidence, that even challenges that seemed negative were actually preparing you for something bigger. And this perception completely changes the way you see yourself within your own story. There is also a sense of responsibility that comes along with this revelation. Because when you understand that there is a purpose, you can no longer live indifferently. Something inside you awakens, bringing the awareness that your decisions do not only affect you, but can impact other lives, other paths, other destinations. And it transforms the way you think. The mind is no longer limited to the immediate present and begins to consider what God is building in the long run. Decisions become more conscious. Attitudes start to carry more meaning, and even small movements begin to be made with more attention. The most striking thing is that this revelation does not come to confuse, but to position. It brings clarity, direction, and a quiet certainty that you're exactly where you need to be to accomplish something greater. Even though not everything is clear yet, there is a conviction that there is a plan being revealed. It is written, "Who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther 4:14. And perhaps, at this moment, something inside of you is starting to fall into place. Situations that once seemed disconnected begin to make sense, and a new vision begins to emerge. Few people stop to notice this, but if you are here, it is because something is being revealed. Keep on your toes, because what's yet to come may open your eyes in a way you've never seen before. There is a level of God's voice that not only guides paths, but enters areas of the mind that were disorganized, wounded, or even imprisoned. Because the problem is not always in external decisions, it is often inside, in the way you think, interpret, and react. And when the mind is not in order, everything around it seems confusing, heavy, and difficult to deal with. There are times when thoughts seem out of control. Negative ideas are repeated, memories weigh down, feelings are mixed, and clarity simply disappears. It is as if the mind is in a constant state of noise, without rest, without direction. And the most difficult thing is that, many times, the person does not know how to get out of it. You try to change, you try to think differently, but something keeps pulling you to the same place. It is at this point that God's voice manifests itself in a restorative way, not just as a direction, but as an intervention. One thought begins to emerge more strongly than the others, bringing light where there was confusion before. It's not just a positive idea, it's something that reorganizes, that calms, that brings a sense of clarity that wasn't there before. This voice does not fight with chaos, it dispels it. She doesn't get into the mess to fight for space. She brings a presence that simply makes the rest lose strength, and little by little, what seemed out of control begins to line up. Thoughts become clearer, emotions stabilize, and the mind begins to find a new state of balance. The most striking thing is that this restoration does not only happen on the surface. It goes deeper. It reaches areas that were marked by fear, pain, past experiences that still influence the way of thinking. And when you touch these areas, something begins to be rebuilt, not just to lighten the moment, but to transform the base. And when this transformation happens, the perception changes completely. What once seemed impossible to control no longer has the same power. The mind regains control, regains clarity, reworks in an aligned way. Not because everything around has changed, but because something inside has been restored. There is freedom in this, a freedom that does not depend on external circumstances, but on a mind that has been touched, reorganized, and renewed by the voice of God. And this freedom brings a peace that is not superficial, but profound, stable, real. It is written, "And they found him, clothed, and in his right mind," Mark 5:15. There is a confirmation that does not come from outside. It does not depend on audible words, nor on visible signs. It happens inside, silently, but extremely powerfully. It is as if, in the midst of so many thoughts, a certainty emerges that does not need to be explained. It is not a passing emotion. It is not momentary enthusiasm. It is something deeper, more stable, which remains even when everything around you changes. This is one of the most intimate ways God speaks to the mind, not only bringing direction or correction, but revealing identity. Because there is a difference between believing in God and knowing within yourself that you belong to Him. And this knowledge does not come from arguments, it does not come from logic, it comes from an internal testimony that is simply established. You can even try to question, you can try to doubt, you can even face moments of weakness. But this conviction does not disappear completely. It stands as a foundation, as a deep root that sustains your faith even when the mind tries to waver. It is as if something inside you is constantly saying that there is a real, living connection that does not depend on circumstances. The most interesting thing is that this confirmation does not make noise. She doesn't need to convince. She doesn't need to compete for space with other thoughts. It simply is. And the more you become sensitive to it, the more that certainty grows, the more it takes up space, the more it strengthens your spiritual security. It completely changes the way you live. Because when this identity is firm within you, doubts lose strength, fear decreases, and insecurities begin to dissipate. Not because you will never have challenges again, but because there is now a foundation that does not shake easily. You stop living trying to prove something and start living from a certainty. And this certainty influences everything. Your decisions, your reactions, your way of seeing yourself and the world. Because when you know who you are before God, you no longer have to look elsewhere for validation. There is a peace that comes from this identity, a stability that does not depend on anyone's opinion. And that's one of the deepest voices that God releases within the mind. not just to give you external direction, but to position you internally, so that you don't just follow a path, but understand who you are as you walk. It is written, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are the children of God, Romans 8:16. And if this message brought a silent confirmation within you, as if something was being firmed in a deeper way, don't let it go unnoticed. If this spoke to your heart, write in the comments, I trust in God's action. Sometimes stating this is the way to further strengthen that which has already begun to be established within you. There are thoughts that repeat themselves for so long that they come to seem like absolute truth. Ideas about who you are, about what you can or can't do, about how far you can go. And without realizing it, these thoughts create invisible limits, shaping decisions, blocking attitudes, and preventing advances. They are not external barriers, they are internal constructions that have become so familiar that they are no longer questioned. These mental cycles feed on repetition. The more you think the same way, the more it gets stronger. And over time, the mind begins to automatically reject any idea that contradicts this pattern. Even when an opportunity arises, even when there is a different direction, something inside resists. Not because it is not possible, but because it does not fit what you have come to believe about yourself. The most dangerous thing is that these thoughts don't seem negative all the time. Sometimes they come disguised as humility, prudence, realism. But deep down, they carry limitations that did not come from God. And as long as these patterns remain, God's voice finds it difficult to flow freely, because everything he speaks must pass through this ancient filter. That's where something powerful happens. God doesn't just speak to guide paths, he speaks to confront these inner structures. And when that happens, the first reaction of the mind is estrangement. Because what he says often clashes directly with what you've always believed. Suddenly a different thought arises, a perception that does not match his old vision, an internal statement that seems too bold, too far from what you've become accustomed to thinking. And at that moment, there is a silent confrontation going on. On the one hand, the old pattern trying to maintain itself. On the other, a new truth trying to establish itself. And this truth does not come to please, it comes to liberate. It breaks through limitations, challenges old beliefs, and repositions its identity. Not in a superficial way, but in a profound way. It's as if God is rewriting the way you see yourself, replacing insecurity with conviction, fear with clarity, limitation with purpose. But it requires a choice, because you can listen to this new truth and reject it, going back to the old pattern, or you can accept it, allowing it to start transforming your mind little by little. And the more you accept it, the more that old cycle loses strength. What once seemed impossible is starting to seem achievable. What used to generate fear is starting to generate movement. And in this process, your mind ceases to be a place of imprisonment and becomes a space of expansion, not because everything has changed around it, but because something inside has been repositioned. And when that happens, you begin to live according to what God says about you, no longer what you have always believed. It is written, "The Lord is with thee, O mighty man of valor." Judges 6:12. There are times when the mind becomes a real battlefield. You analyze, think, reconsider, try to find the best way, but the more you think, the more confused you get. These are important decisions, choices that carry weight, consequences that cannot be ignored. And in this scenario, doubt begins to grow, dividing your thoughts, creating opposite scenarios, and taking away your peace. This type of situation reveals something profound. The human mind, by itself, has limits. It tries to predict, calculate, control, but it can't always see everything. And when faced with complex decisions, they often enter a cycle of uncertainty. It is at this point that God's voice becomes essential, not as another opinion, but as a source of clarity that goes beyond ordinary logic. When God speaks at times like this, He does not add to the confusion, He simplifies. Suddenly, what seemed to be scrambled begins to organize, not necessarily because all the answers appear at once, but because the direction becomes clear. It is as if a light were turned on in the midst of doubt, highlighting the path that was previously hidden. This clarity is not accompanied by pressure, but by understanding. You begin to notice details that you didn't see before, to consider aspects that weren't being taken into account, to see consequences in a more balanced way. And little by little, that feeling of being lost begins to give way to a calm, firm conviction that does not need urgency to exist. The most interesting thing is that this direction often does not follow the most obvious path. It can even go against expectations, defy logic, or go out of the ordinary pattern. But still, it carries an internal coherence that makes sense in a deeper way. It's not just a rational choice, it's an aligned decision. And when you decide to trust that clarity, something changes. The mind calms down, the weight of indecision lessens, and the action begins to flow more safely. Not because you have complete control over the future, but because there is now a direction that sustains your steps. This kind of wisdom cannot be produced by human effort alone. It is granted. It is the result of a mind that opens itself to listen beyond itself, that recognizes its limits and allows God to guide the understanding. And the more you seek this clarity in the right way, the more it becomes accessible, not as something automatic, but as an ongoing relationship, where every decision becomes an opportunity to listen more accurately. It is written, "Behold, I have given thee a wise and understanding heart," 1 Kings 3:12. There are answers from God that don't come in the form of immediate words, nor in clear directions at the time you expect them. They come in a different way, quieter, deeper, through time. And that completely challenges the human mind, because everything inside you wants an answer now, a quick solution, an immediate confirmation. But in many cases, God responds by saying to wait, even without saying it directly. The hardest thing is not just waiting, it's dealing with what's going on inside your mind as time goes by. Thoughts begin to arise, doubts begin to grow, questions are repeated. You remember what you felt, what you understood, what you believed, and begins to question whether it really happened. And in that process, the mind tries to find signs, tries to speed up responses, tries to fill the silence, but there's something going on in that range that you don't always notice. God is not only preparing what has been promised, He is preparing you. Because some answers require a different mind than the one you had when you received the direction. They demand more maturity, more stability, more confidence. And this is not built overnight. Time, in this case, is not delay. It is a tool. It is the space where your faith ceases to be based on emotion and is sustained by conviction. Because it's easy to believe when everything is happening, but to stand firm when nothing seems to change. This transforms your way of thinking. Your mind begins to adjust, to strengthen, to depend less on signs and more on what has been established within you. And little by little, something changes. Anxiety begins to lose strength, haste decreases, and a new form of confidence begins to emerge. It is not an empty wait, it is a conscious wait. You are no longer just waiting for an answer, you are being transformed while it does not arrive. There is also an important detail. When the answer finally manifests, you realize that it wasn't just about what you were hoping for, but about who you became during the process. Because time has not only revealed the answer, it has shaped your mind to receive it in the right way. And that changes everything. Because now you understand that God is not bound by His time, but works on a deeper level where every step has a purpose. And even when it seems to take time, nothing is out of control. It is written, for the vision is yet to be fulfilled at the appointed time. If he delays, Habakkuk 2:3 waits for him, and maybe you're right now where the answer hasn't come yet, where time seems too long. But keep going, because in the next few moments, something may fall into place in a way you didn't expect, bringing a clarity that only God's timing can reveal. There is something about the way God speaks that defies the rush of the human mind. He doesn't reveal everything at once. It doesn't give away the complete path. It doesn't show all the details. It doesn't anticipate each step. And this often generates unrest. Because the mind wants to understand the whole, it wants to have control, it wants to know exactly where it is going. But God works differently. He reveals it in parts. In the beginning, there is only a simple understanding, an initial direction, something sufficient to take the first step. And for many, this seems little. It seems incomplete. It seems that something is missing. But what is not realized is that that is enough for that moment, because each revelation is linked to the ability you have to understand and sustain what is being shown. If God revealed everything at once, the mind would not be able to stand it, not only because of the complexity, but because of the weight. There are things that need to be matured within you before they can be fully understood, and that's why revelation comes in levels. One step liberates the next. One understanding makes room for another, and so, little by little, everything is being built. The problem is that many people stop in the middle of the process. They receive the first direction, but they do not advance because they want to see the rest before acting. And with that, they end up blocking what would still be revealed, because God does not show the next step to those who have not taken the first. There is a flow, a sequence that needs to be respected, and as you walk, something starts to change inside your mind. What didn't make sense before begins to fall into place. Past situations take on new meaning. Words that seemed simple reveal depths that you didn't notice before. It is as if his vision was being expanded, not all at once, but progressively. This process also reveals something important. God isn't just leading you to a destination, he's forming you along the way. Each step has a purpose. Each level of understanding builds something within you. And when you get to a new level, you realize that you wouldn't have been able to understand that before. This requires trust. It requires accepting that not everything will be revealed in its time, but at the right time. It requires walking even without having all the answers, knowing that what you need to know will be shown at the right time. And when you understand that, anxiety decreases. The need for control loses strength. You begin to value every step, every little revelation, every detail that God releases along the way. Because he understands that everything is part of a larger process. It is written, I have yet much to say unto you, but ye cannot bear it now. John 16:12. There is a profound difference between knowing about God and walking with him in an intimate way. Because the farther away someone is, the harder it becomes to recognize his voice clearly. Everything seems confusing, uncertain, distant. But as that distance narrows, something begins to change inside the mind. Perception becomes more sensitive, details are noticed, and what once seemed silent begins to become clear. Intimacy with God is not built in isolated moments, but in constancy. It is in everyday life, in simple thoughts, in silent conversations, in moments when no one is watching. It is in this continuous relationship that the mind is being tuned. As someone who learns to recognize one familiar voice among many others, you begin to identify when it is God speaking, even if it is in a subtle way. The most interesting thing is that this proximity does not depend on perfection, but on willingness. It's not about knowing everything, but about being present. And the closer you get, the more natural it becomes to notice when something comes from him. Not because his voice has become louder, but because his sensitivity has increased. There is also a depth that is only accessed at this level of relationship. It's not just superficial directions, but nuances, small adjustments, more refined perceptions, understandings that are not obvious to anyone. It is as if the mind begins to operate at a different frequency, more aligned, more connected, and it completely transforms the way you live. Because you no longer depend only on specific moments to hear God. Communication becomes continuous. In thoughts, in decisions, in simple everyday perceptions, there is a constant awareness that He is present, guiding, adjusting, revealing. But this intimacy also requires something. It demands time, it demands attention, it demands choice, because there are many things that compete with that space within the mind. Distractions, worries, constant noises. And if that space isn't protected, that sensitivity starts to be lost. Therefore, the more you value this proximity, the more it grows. The more you search, the more you realize. And the more you realize, the more you want to stay in that place. Because it is there that the mind finds clarity, peace, and direction on an ongoing basis. And little by little, something settles inside you. A living, constant consciousness that does not depend on external circumstances. A perception that recognizes the presence of God, not only in extraordinary moments, but in every detail. It is written, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you," James 4:8. There is a point in the spiritual journey where the mind stops living just to solve the present and begins to see life from something bigger. Until then, decisions are made based on what is most urgent, what seems safest, what brings immediate results. But when God begins to align His thoughts with the eternal purpose, something changes profoundly. The focus is no longer just on the now and starts to consider what has value beyond time. This alignment does not happen automatically. It starts when you realize that not everything that seems important at the moment really has eternal weight. Situations that once dominated your mind begin to lose intensity, while others, which were previously ignored, start to gain relevance. It is as if your vision is elevated, allowing you to see beyond immediate circumstances, and it completely changes the way you think. Decisions are no longer guided only by emotion, pressure, or convenience, but are filtered by a deeper understanding. You begin to ask not only what is better now, but what is in line with what God is building, and this simple change of perspective transforms everything. What's interesting is that when the mind aligns with the eternal purpose, certain choices become clearer, even if they're difficult, because you are no longer stuck only in the comfort or approval of others. There is something greater guiding you, a conviction that sustains your decisions even when they don't make sense to outsiders. This kind of thinking also brings freedom. Freedom not to depend only on the immediate, not to get lost in momentary pressures, not to live reacting to everything that happens. You start to live with direction, with intention, with awareness that each step is part of something bigger. And the more you position yourself in this way, the more your mind gets stronger. What used to generate doubt begins to become clear. What used to cause anxiety begins to lose strength. Because now you're no longer trying to control everything. You're walking within a purpose that goes beyond what you can fully see. There is also a sense of focus that is born in this alignment. Distractions begin to lose space, priorities are adjusted, and your energy is directed to what really matters, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. You begin to realize that living this way is not a loss, but a much greater gain. It is written, "I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus," Philippians 3:14. And perhaps at this moment, something inside you is being repositioned, as if your way of thinking is being elevated to see beyond what you saw before. Continue to the end, because what is yet to come can take you to a level of clarity and direction that you have never experienced before. There is a kind of voice from God that does not come to give you immediate practical direction, but to put something inside you that was not there before. It's not a common idea, it's not a passing thought. It's a burden, a concern that arises unexpectedly, but that does not disappear. You try to follow your routine, you try to focus on other things, but it keeps coming back, taking up space in your mind persistently. At first, it may seem like just a common emotion or concern, but over time, you realize that it's different. It's not just linked to you. It's not something that was born out of a personal situation. It is as if you were feeling something for someone, for a place, for a situation that in some way was placed inside you. This is one of the most profound ways God speaks. Not bringing answers, but awakening intercession. He puts on his mind a spiritual burden that needs to be carried to him in prayer, and this does not happen by chance. There is a purpose behind it, something that is being moved in the unseen, but that needs someone sensitive enough to respond. The most interesting thing is that this charge is not accompanied by complete explanations. You don't understand everything, you don't know all the details, but you feel it. And this feeling is not superficial. It moves you, bothers you, calls you to a deeper place. It's as if God is inviting you to participate in something that goes beyond what your eyes can see. And when you respond to that, something starts to happen. Your mind connects with a different level of sensitivity. Prayer is no longer just repeated words and becomes a more intense, truer, more directed dialogue. You begin to realize that you are not just talking, you are cooperating with something bigger. There is also an internal transformation in this process. Because as you intercede, something inside you is aligned. Your way of thinking changes, your perception expands, and you begin to see situations more deeply, not only for what appears, but for what is behind. And the more you allow yourself to enter that place, the more sensitive you become to recognizing when God is putting something in your mind. Small signs begin to gain meaning, perceptions become clearer, and you understand that you are not just living for yourself, but participating in something bigger. It is written, "I sat down and wept, and I have been fasting and praying before the God of heaven." Nehemiah 1:4. And if, while you are listening to this, something or someone came to your mind insistently, maybe this is not just a memory. It may be a call to intercede. If you feel like this word has come at the right time, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Sometimes acknowledging this call is the first step to seeing something powerful happen. Everything that has been awakened so far has not only been for understanding, but for positioning. Because when God speaks to the mind in so many different ways, there is a moment when listening is no longer enough. It is necessary to respond. It is necessary to open up. It is necessary to allow all this to leave the thought and reach the heart in a real and transformative way. Maybe you have noticed signs, memories, directions, restlessness. Maybe something inside you has been touched in a way that you can no longer ignore. And this did not happen by chance. There is an invitation being made now, not to think more, but to surrender more, to silence what is still distracting and create space for a true encounter with God. The word reminds us, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." 1 Samuel 3:10. This is the time to transform everything that has been understood into surrender, to stop just analyzing and start positioning yourself spiritually. Now open your heart, quiet your mind, and allow this time of prayer to become a point of direct connection, where God not only speaks but also touches, heals, and directs deeply. Beloved Father, your word declares, "Teach me to do your will, for you are my God." And it is with this sincere desire that we now stand before you, with an open mind and a surrendered heart, recognizing that we need to hear your voice clearly in the midst of so many thoughts and distractions. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching that has touched our minds, for every direction that has brought light where there was confusion, and for showing us that you are not distant but present, speaking, guiding, and transforming from the inside out. Now, Father, we ask you, strengthen us to live all that we have learned. Give us wisdom to discern your voice above all others, courage to obey even when we don't fully understand, and faith to sustain what you have already spoken within us. Align our thoughts with your will. Remove all deception, all doubt, and all confusion that tries to lead us away from your direction. May our minds be renewed, steadfast, and sensitive to your presence. Lord, look also at every need presented here. It touches those who are afflicted, bringing peace where there is anxiety. He visits those facing illness, releasing healing and restoration. It opens doors for those who are facing financial difficulties, bringing provision at the right time. It restores families, rebuilds relationships, and strengthens those who are feeling weak, tired, or directionless. May every area of life be reached by your grace. At this moment, Father, in silence, each heart turns to you with requests that only you know. It receives every unspoken prayer, every hidden tear, every cry that has not been expressed in words, but that is alive within the soul. We commend everything into your hands, Lord. Our thoughts, our decisions, our fears, our dreams, and all our way. We trust that the Lord is in control, even when we don't understand, even when we don't see, even when time seems long. May your will prevail in us, because we know that it is perfect. May your peace, which passeth all understanding, now guard our minds and hearts in Christ Jesus, bringing rest, clarity, and direction, and that, from today on, we can live as living proof that the Lord still speaks, still guides, and still transforms. We pray in faith, trusting in your love and power. In Jesus' name, amen. When you get this far, something inside you is no longer the same, because understanding how God speaks in your mind is not just acquiring knowledge. It is awakening to a spiritual reality that has always been present, but perhaps was not clearly perceived. Every aligned thought, every subtle direction, every sense of peace or uneasiness carried a message. And now you begin to see that God has never been silent. He has always been speaking. This message is for you, and it is no coincidence that you have come this far. God chose you to hear this today, to awaken your sensitivity, to align your mind and transform your way of living. And now there is a question that only you can answer. Will you continue to ignore these signs, or will you start living attentive to the voice of God within you? And first of all, let me tell you something very sincerely. It is a joy to have you here, walking together on this journey of faith. You are not alone. There is an entire community seeking to hear God's voice more clearly. So I want to invite you from the heart to be part of this in an active way. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, and activate the bell so you don't miss any message like this. But more than that, I want to get to know you better. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share something you have been living. Your story matters, and it can be an answer for someone who is also here, and what you heard today is just the beginning. There is so much more that God wants to reveal, so much more depth, so much more direction that can completely transform the way you live, decide, and think. In the next video, you will dive even deeper into this path, understanding how to constantly live in God's presence and recognize His signs in everyday life even more clearly. It's not just content, it's continuity. It's a next step that could change everything. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.